and what all it does.
Hey guys.
I was It's gonna be one of those kind of days. Okay, one more time. Hi everybody, welcome back to the Unreal Engine live stream. I'm your host Alexander Pascal. Joining me today is Ryan Brooks. He's going to be talking about a brand new plugin that he's made. Sorry, now I'm all giggly. And we're going to check it out and work around in it. We've got some VR equipment set up. It'll be fun. Ryan, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've made and how it works?
Hey guys. So this stuff I'm going to share with you guys today is kind of a follow-up to the GDC talk that I gave earlier this year. No audio?
Chance, we know. We just fixed it. My boss, everybody.
Sorry, we just had Chance warning
bye.
us about a lack of audio, but it had already been fixed, so sorry about that. So this is mostly a follow-up to my GDC talk where I showed a bunch of little things that you can do using render targets directly inside of the engine now. As of, I think, 4.13, when Daniel Wright added the ability to script drawing to a render target directly from a blueprint. So my GDC talk, for those who haven't seen it, went over a couple little things you can do with that, such as painting damage on characters, painting textures, doing fluid simulations, and things like that. And I kind of showed a little one-off tricks there, and then was talking about releasing that as a content plugin at some point. It took a little bit longer than expected due to a couple things. For one, it took a little bit of time to recharge after GDC, and then of course I got very immersed into Horizon Zero Dawn. Ended up getting the Platinum Trophy in that game, which took around 86 hours, but it was totally worth it.
Yeah, I went over and checked it out. He's very good at it.
Yeah, me and Alexander played it a little bit together. It was fun. Haven't played a game that long for years, so it was really great to get back into heavy gaming for me. But yeah, without further ado, so now I've made a content plugin. So I'm just going to quickly show you guys the process to enable that in your project. So a content plugin, once you've copied the plugin to your plugins directory in your project, it should show up down inside of the plugins, which is again under Edit Plugins, down under Project. We have Shader Bits GDC Pack, and once that's enabled there, you should have things showing up in your content browser. So you may have to go down here to the content browser and select Show Plugin Content. And you may also want to have to turn off Show C++ Classes, because that will also show a bunch of C++ plugins if you have that enabled, which kind of clutter it up. But once you have that exposed, you should see these different folders under the GDC pack. And these are the various demos that we're going to go over today, kind of starting from the bottom up, just because we wanted to get the VR part of this out of the way first, and then move on to some of the fluid simulation techniques, as well as capturing them to a flipbook. So I guess first I'm just going to go over an overview of how some of this three-dimensional texture stuff is being handled. So here, this is under Volume Preview, which is the map down here under volume textures. There's a blueprint for creating them, and just this little map for looking at them and kind of debugging them. Oops. And what this does here is it is a blueprint that provides me a little handle where I can move this point around, and I can move around the sphere within the 3D texture. And you can kind of see how it's being laid out as a 2D flipbook there. And I can scale different axes of this, such as the green axis, to add more noise. So that's the strength of the noise. It can be either positive or negative. And the material that it's using to render that is pretty simple. This is the whole material here. I know you guys are probably used to seeing more scary materials, but this one's not too bad. So we use this function called encode volume coordinates here. And if I preview it, you can see it here. And this just gives you kind of those three-dimensional coordinates laid out as a 2D flipbook. And then you can go ahead and sample things like the noise node, which here we're using fast gradient 3D texture because it's the fastest one. And then we're combining it with the sphere mask by simply getting the distance to a point and then dividing that by a certain radius. And we're using it to offset the distance here. So that's why changing the amount of noise just by changing this n parameter is what allows the field to grow and shrink. So again, we have a distance here, which this is going positive. Never mind. This one is actually not going negative. But it keeps on increasing the distance away from whatever point, which is what allows it to be manipulated by just changing the scale. And that shows kind of the basic setup that's used under the hood for the things we're going to jump into next, where we're going to show how this is used to paint some volume textures. And that involves going into VR, since it didn't seem like there was a really great way to do that outside of VR other than compositing procedural shapes. So I'm going to go ahead and jump over to a test map that has some of this stuff set up for VR. So this is a blueprint like before, but it has a lot more controls, including the ability to paint inside of VR, which that's what this little dot you see here is actually the preview location of your brush. Will show up as green emissive inside the viewport. And you can tell it what shape to start with by using an existing material. For example, here I'm seeding it with this existing volume texture. But I can also blank that out if I want to. Oop. Hang on a second. This mouse might be a little bit low battery.
Oh, is it? Oh, hang on. It might be the connectors over there. I'm getting some interference.
There we go. Sorry, guys. The mouse was losing
Just
signal.
a little interference. Sorry.
Okay, so down here under seeds, I have this blank material. So I can tell it to write to a blank material there. So I start with nothing. So one of the ways to kind of add to this is to use these shapes here. Which this is the non-VR version of this, where you can kind of drop down these little procedural shapes and move them around. And this will be compositing a layer into the volume texture, so I can scale and rotate this shape. Which is kind of neat, but still you don't get great control when you're compositing these shapes, and it's a little bit messy in terms of the blueprint right now. There's these two different arrays. One is an array of types, which allows you to change the material for each shape, and the other is the array of transforms, which is what gives you this editable widget to drag around. And they're meant to be the same length. If you have more in transforms than you have in your shape list, it'll just use the one shape type you have, or you can also have a different shape per transform. And there's a couple different ones in here. For example, the 3D vortex should work. This one is actually meant to be kind of a tornado field, where the X and the Y are the slope of the tornado. So I can kind of create these different cones and plane shapes. But mostly what we wanted to show today for this was the VR side of this. So you can go ahead and not use any of these procedural shapes down here and start with a blank canvas. But I'm going to go ahead and put back the density seed material just so we have something in there to orient when we pop into VR. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into VR now. Give me just 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
And so this stuff is a little bit built on some test content that I've had for a couple years now. For example, this radial menu here. This goes back to around 2 years ago when Nick Donaldson and I were working on a prototype of the VR editor inside of Blueprints. And I created this fairly modular blueprint radial menu system that allows you to delve up and down menus and do different things. And it's generic in that it doesn't have any references to any classes itself. But it can be used by pawns to do different things. So I kind of hijacked it and repurposed it for this painting here. So the first things to show are under actions, I can clear the density or the velocity. So I'm going to go ahead and clear that. And if I go back, I can go to paint modes. And I've got 3 different modes exposed right now, which is paint density, paint velocity, and smudge. So I'm just going to kind of go through what each of those does. So to manipulate this, I've kind of gone with the asymmetrical approach that we have in the VR editor in the main build now, which is asymmetry, where the left hand is your radial menu and your right hand does most of your actual manipulation. So on the thumbstick, up pushes out my little gizmo. Left and right scale the brush. So left and right make it bigger and smaller. And the sensitivity of the trigger is how much I'm actually going to add into the scene. So I can use a small brush and go around and make little trails, or I can make big trails. And to erase, all I have to do is hold the grip while pressing the trigger, and then you can kind of go through and erase different parts of this. So for any one frame when this blueprint is rendering out this volume texture, it's doing the same thing that I showed you guys in that simplified material, which is basically a sphere mask with the position of this motion controller handle, which is basically derived by pushing out that little sphere that's part of my hand blueprint, and then transforming that into the local space of the volume.
And you're just moving the analog stick up and down in order to push it in.
Up and down is kind of like push and pull. There's a slight amount of dead zone to where you have to go a little bit more than the horizontal or vertical axis before the scaling or pushing works, just because otherwise it can be a little tricky where you're accidentally scaling and pushing at the same time, although it's not perfect yet. So it's going to go ahead and painted a little dense sphere, although I want to center it a little bit better. It can be hard to tell exactly the right depth where you're at. Sometimes I'll kind of point it at the ground and use that as a proxy for what the depth is. So now I've got that little sphere there. Next I'm going to show smudging, which works just like it does in Photoshop, where if I grab a little piece of this edge here and move it around, it will just keep on copying whatever colors were there. But you can get some neat effects that way, such as pulling out wisps, and you can also use it to kind of erode into the volume if you'd want as well. So if I start smudging from outside and then push inward, it actually pushes inward on the volume, and then I can also pull outwards. So you can really start to mess with this thing. So I'm going to go back and clear this again real quick, and make something a little goofy real quick. So I'm going to go back to smudge. Just want to show, it's kind of fun to just like paint a little face or something like that, which, not really.
He's so eerie but friendly.
There you go. Carve out his pumpkin carving in VR. There you go. But then the other thing that I've done here is added the ability to paint velocity. So instead of just painting a color, this works a lot like the flow map demonstration that I gave for my GDC talk, where we take the position difference between the current frame and the last frame of this little paint gizmo here, and we paint that into the volume texture, and then we do flow maps in 3D. And so by using that, we can start to do things like tell which way we want this fluid to spin in various ways. So for example, we can make little crazy swirly eyeballs in this guy, and it keeps on accumulating velocity. Since this velocity texture is stored as HDR, it means it can go positive and negative to pretty huge values. So you can actually keep on distorting this, and eventually it'll just kind of make a mess of the fluid. The reason that it doesn't look completely stretched, though, is because I'm actually doing a few iterations of the flow map, where the standard flow map method is to just look up the velocity where your starting location is and read backwards in time from that. You can't actually go around a curl with that approach. So what I've done is to basically take small steps and subdivide those steps, which allows a little bit more accurate tracking of motion, so we can get those curls. So, but once you've messed up your velocity, it's kind of, I don't have a brush erase velocity yet, other than the clear velocity of the entire volume. So you can kind of go back after messing it up and reset it a little bit. And in general, I found if you want to do curling type shapes, it's a good idea to kind of have some underlying shape there that kind of encourages that kind of curling. So for example, if I have some of these curly wisps going up here, and then I kind of paint the velocity with those in mind, it kind of helps them feel like they were more part of it initially. And sometimes you do get a little bit of this kind of backwards flow, which is not completely ideal. That comes from the fact that I'm offsetting the phases of the two flow maps with some noise. And in some cases, that ends up creating this backwards looking feeling, which isn't really ideal, but you can usually get around it by tweaking the scale and the amount of the noise. But yeah, and you can completely just turn it to pretty much junk noise if you just paint massive velocities all over the place. So it'll start to fall apart a little bit.
It's really awesome.
In addition, the performance will get a little bit worse because you start basically accessing these textures randomly all over the place instead of fairly coherently, which does affect the memory. So some of the things that I wanted to do next with this that I hadn't had time to yet was basically exposing different brushes for this while you're painting in VR. I mean, I can go into the material and change the noise to be whatever I want, but I don't yet have it working where I can change the noise inside the editor or inside of VR in terms of the octaves and the scale and things like that. But that's something I'd want to do next is basically make that a little bit easier to go in and do different things with more or less noise. But you can get some fairly convincing shapes just by doing different combinations of erasing and painting and feathering the density. For example, you can kind of feather it and get some real faint clouds if you want as well. And there you can see I'm hitting the top of the volume, so you usually want to try to be aware of where that top of the volume is.
And what do you mean by feathering? What are you doing exactly?
Feathering, just pressing the trigger lightly.
Oh,
so if I press lightly, I get a light cloud.
I see what you mean.
The sensitivity is probably not right where I want it to be yet. Oh, here we go. I'm painting on half of the edge of the volume. That's what I was talking about, where it's a little bit hard to judge the depth of the available volume space. And I'd probably want to add more of a preview bounds to get around that in the future. But yeah, it's pretty sensitive. It probably reaches full density on the trigger a little bit too quickly. But it's nothing that you can't solve just by tweaking the material or reducing your pressing on the trigger a little bit. Or you can make the brush massive and erase the entire thing without going through the menu. So before I jump out of this part, this shows pretty much the current features I have working in here. Was there any questions on the log before I
Oh,
get
yeah.
out of this part and maybe show a little bit about this radial menu system?
So, yeah, we have quite a few questions, mostly about how we can bake this out, turn it into stuff that you're going to get into later, how we can turn it into more practical applications. Yeah, how is the size of the cloud's volume and memory used related? Is a question from Raildex.
So currently this is set up to be 256 cubed, and that ends up storing out to a 4K texture in 2D. So currently it's pretty beefy because you need several render targets of this. This requires 2 full-size render targets for the doing the flow maps. Basically what it does is it always stores just what you've painted in the red channel, and then it does the flow maps and rewrites the red channel into the blue channel using the flow maps, so that you always maintain your original painted data without destroying it. But then that flow map is still baked into the texture, which means during the ray march it doesn't have to look up the flow map, which would be pretty expensive to have to basically do 2 lookups of the volume texture at each ray march iteration. So this is more meant currently as an experimentation. I wouldn't expect that people will be using this blueprint directly inside of a game, other than perhaps as a way to bake out a sub-UV, or as a way to help create a texture that you save off, and you can use this stuff to inject into the new volumetric fog that is in 4.16 by Daniel Wright. So I've done some tests kind of trying to combine the two, and it's pretty promising.
That actually answers some questions about that fog, too.
Yeah, we were going to want to go into how to use this with the volume fog today, but I'm not sure there's going to be enough time, and I didn't get the example content I have ported into this main build. What we have is still, I have some stuff that I did for that, but it's in a private internal branch that's on a future change list, unfortunately.
Oh, that's all right. I'm already planning to have Daniel Wright come on to do a stream for that, so I'll just have you come on too, and then we'll talk about it.
Yeah, I can come maybe toward the end of that and just show some quick tests. And Jordan Walker's also done a lot of cool tests on Paragon using the volume fog as well. So there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do there. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and jump out of VR right now, since I think we've shown decently, just some of the cool ways to manipulate the volume textures, or pseudo volume textures, I should say.
Your hands just flew off into the distance.
Oh, nice.
There we go. Yeah, we've got quite a few people asking about how everything was built, but we're getting into that now, everyone.
Yep. So just going to spend just a quick second showing the radial menu. Oops. So this is, again, a pretty old radial menu, where it was made, like I said before, when me and Nick were doing some VR editor prototypes and blueprints that never actually saw the light of day, because we decided to hold off showing a prototype version of the VR editor in favor of, the code team getting it up working for real inside of the actual editor. So hang on here, I'm just finding the root widget. Here we go. So the way that this blueprint works is that it automatically creates its menus from a set of data-only widgets. So I've gone to one in the content browser. So you can see here that I have this radial menu painting root, and this contains some widget info that basically says I am a category, and because it's a category, nothing else in this category matters. And then all it cares about is its sub-widgets. And so these sub-widgets then go to other data-only assets. For example, the paint modes, which was the erase and velocity and things like that, itself is another category, which has children, which are paint density, paint velocity, and smudge, which those each signify something about an index that the pawn uses to decide which mode to be in. But it's set up to be pretty extensible, where you could change the entire root structure just by changing the root node and changing what its children are. And I've used it for tons of things, including mocking up games with inventories and things like that. So that wheel menu, it should be pretty fun for you guys to mess with. And it just happened to be a good fit to use that here as well. So in terms of going into directly how this was the fluid sim itself, or the painting works, I don't know that we have time to get into too much detail, because I also wanted to go into some of the fluid sim stuff, which is a little bit different. But probably will write more of a follow-up blog post that breaks down the specifics of this stuff, as well as I plan to continue on adding features and making it more polished.
Oh, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to fluid sim stuff, just because we already used up 20 minutes and I want to kind of get time to hit everything. So under Fluid Sim, we have a couple different maps for Fluid Sim 2D and 3D of different styles. I'm going to go ahead and start in 2D. And what we have here is this little Fluid Sim blueprint, which under basic setup here, we have not checked the 3D box, which means it's a 2D sim. And so we've set the resolution here as 500. And when I actually go to play this, my mouse, when I click and drag, will take over that little black dot. And then I can disturb the fluid by just dragging it around. And you'll notice that it actually displaces fluid that's in front of it as well, rather than just adding its velocity. So it's kind of fun to go around here and just kind of move it around. And I can use the mouse wheel to increase or decrease the scale. And you'll notice that when you increase the scale, it actually sends out a shock wave of pressure. And this is just a good test case for simple fluid transitions or fluid boundaries and things like that. So you notice if I make a really big brush, as I move it around, it very quickly creates negative pressure behind it to drag in that fluid that's been displaced. And currently, when I go drag from the edge, it's actually still reading the original color. I'm going to go ahead and stop that.
In a way, it's a good way to bring new color into it. Eventually, it
Exactly.
just blurs into a muck of brown, right?
That is true. That's one of the reasons I didn't fix that.
Which is accurate if you just keep mixing paint.
So this was kind of the start of setting up the Fluid Sim stuff, just because 2D is a little bit easier to get started working. But it's not terribly different. In fact, the blueprint is actually the same between the 2D and 3D versions. Just what you're controlling is a little bit different between the two. So if I go over to the 3D map, which is a little bit more interesting, this is kind of the culmination between that first example where we're just manipulating a little box and then using the Fluid Sim in 3D to seed that. So there's a couple different things going on here. Most of what we're seeing right now is we're setting up the seed of the sim by moving around this little dot. And so if we go under color seed setup, you can see that we have a couple controls here, such as the density multiplier and the temperature amount. Oops. So if I set temperature to 0, we have no temperature. Temperature to 1 is white hot. And we can also, we're kind of losing some text field. Here we go. So temperature inset is basically how far inside the volume that heat core exists. But it uses the shape of the density to form where there's temperature. And then edge hardness, pretty much just a way to change how much transition softness there is in that edge. Generally, a lot of different settings work. So that sets up the seed of the color. And the seed of the velocity I'll get to in a little bit. But this allows you to do things like start with a certain amount of curl noise or add radial force or things like that into the field. But these two things here, seed, velocity, and color, is basically what you're doing on the very start of the simulation, things that will not happen after the first frame. For things that happen every frame, that will be under simulation. So we have things like the advection material, which for the most part you won't have to modify because a lot of those controls are exposed here to the blueprint. But this controls things like how many iterations the fluid solver does, the time step, and you can control things like constant curl noise, or density erosion and temperature buoyancy. So I'm going to go ahead and hit simulate on this sim here. So we can see that we had a little bit of curl noise and the fire rose up. So I'm going to kind of break down what's going on there into its component parts just to kind of show exactly what's been going on. So if I go to seed velocity field, I'm going to go ahead and turn curl 1 strength to 0, curl 2 strength to 0. So now pretty much the only velocity we have is our temperature. So as I play this, we'll see a little mini mushroom cloud form and then leave the bounds of our volume there. And that, again, even though we defined the initial amount of temperature down in color, the way that that affects the simulation is defined under simulation, and that's going to be under temperature buoyancy. So you see if I set temperature buoyancy to 0, all we get is that temperature dying out. And again, the temperature dying out is affected by this temperature dampening. So if I set temperature dampening to 0, even though this is simulating, it'll never change because we have no temperature buoyancy. And again, we can even have negative temperature buoyancy, which is like saying it's cold.
Whoa.
And it will just leave the volume. And of course, you usually want to position this to where you'll have more space to capture something. But yeah, so you can have cold fire if you're into that kind of thing. Gonna move it back down.
If you're just into manipulating everything to be the opposite of what it is.
Exactly. So someone just asked about performance. I can kind of see some of the questions that scroll by. Currently, doing this fluid sim is pretty expensive. It really depends on the setup of resolution. So right now I have the default resolution set to 196 cubed, and that is about the maximum that I would go on a 980, but it will still take around 10 plus milliseconds to do the fluid solve, assuming you have at least 20 iterations of the Jacobi iterations. And there's a lot of things you can do to make it run a little bit faster, such as changing this pressure divisor. It basically says calculate pressure at a lower resolution, and that makes it quite a bit faster. So we can show the FPS. We're on a Titan here. So let me go ahead and set pressure divisor to 1 and do a sim. So it's running around 25 FPS at a pressure of 1. At a divisor of 2, you can see that makes a big difference. Now it's at 70 FPS. So it really is all about the pressure resolution and things like the number of steps. So if I reduce the iterations to 4, for example, it's going to be really fast. It's 100 FPS now, but it doesn't look very good, and the smoke doesn't evolve very realistically. So the iterations is really what allows it to spread and propagate pressure waves. And if there's time, I'll try to go into a little bit more about that. But again, if you're interested more in learning about the fluid dynamics and things like that, I would search for the GPU Gems GPU fluid simulation paper, or watch my GDC talk where I gave a pretty good overview of the various mathematical components there, such as advection, divergence, pressure iterations, and subtracting pressure gradients, and things like that.
I also really like your one on caustics.
Yeah, so the caustics is actually the only part of my GDC talk that didn't make it into this plugin, just because it was a little bit more difficult to separate out. But that will be coming in a follow-up hopefully soon, within the next month or two.
That's awesome.
So getting back to this a little bit, make sure that we left this in a decent state. I'm going to set the pressure back to 1 just so it's a little bit more detailed. And I'm going to go back up to seed velocity setup, and I'm going to start turning on some of this stuff such as curl strength and curl 1 and 2. And these are basically both just curl noises that you can tweak the tiling of each one. So now that I have some curl noise back in there, this mouse is not liking me.
Is it doing that thing again?
So notice we have a little bit of kind of start noise, and that's based off this curl noise here, which, you know, if I set some ridiculous amount like 4, you'll actually see it turn to noise. And that's basically what happens when you try to take too big of a step per frame. So one way to do that is to slow down time step, but generally try to avoid using big numbers for the initial seed velocities. Okay. And if we want to actually start previewing exactly what that velocity does, we can go down here to debug under show velocity and preview. So there's a couple different things to take note of here. I'm going to turn off the fog. Man, this mouse.
I'm sorry.
So
We'll have to fix that.
when we have this velocity density mask at 0, it's basically saying, do we want to preview the velocity field everywhere or only where there's some density inside of our seed? So in this case, we're looking at just that little, if I move this point around, it'll move around the velocities as well.
Hey Ryan,
Yeah.
give me like 2 seconds, I'm gonna swap out.
Hang on, Clint's trying to swap out the mouse receiver real quick.
Thanks,
so.
Clint. He's always.
Which one's the,
We'll fix it in production.
Did you lose keyboard?
Keyboard is lost, yep.
Okay, give me a second.
Just 1 second, guys, sorry. Yeah, $10 mouse, $5,000 computer. Sounds about
Absolutely
right.
true.
So there's the magnets in this monitor.
Yeah.
The segment, so we have to have this extension.
Clint is saying it's magnets in the monitor. It's always magnets.
Magnets in the clouds and chemtrail.
Miracles, man. That's how it happens. Yep.
All right, so that should work. What's that look?
Okay, so far so good. All right. So there we go, that's much nicer. So now I can move around this little seed and look at the velocity. So we can watch the sim unfold with the velocities, which can be kind of neat just for debugging purposes, or we can make this thing a little bigger if we want to look at it. But the cool thing about showing the velocities, is it allows you to really tweak the noise that you want to have. So if I have that on and I go back to this curl setup, now I can show the effect of the different curl tilings. I'm increasing the tiling here and then decreasing it. And the way that you get different kind of start behavior is there's this noise field position offset. And you can think of this as just like a random seed, where I'm panning the world position where I start this curl noise from. And each time I'll get a slightly different reaction. And you can scrub these too, but I would recommend not to scrub this blueprint just because it's a little bit beefy. And sometimes you'll get a hitch when you do the scrub, which I just did there to show why you shouldn't do it. But although that's a worse hitch than I usually get, it shouldn't be that bad. So yeah, scrubbing these parameters is probably not the best idea.
There we go.
But you can basically just wanted to show that this is, just offsetting. Oh, I killed the editor. I think.
And we're live. Oh, all right. So
sorry
ray
about that,
marching
guys.
is right up there. Luckily, we have it right on hand.
So that's mostly likely a bug with it not remembering the render targets. It shouldn't recreate them if they already exist, but that's another reason why you shouldn't scrub the parameters with that blueprint.
Making
they're
a
proof.
note.
But yeah, that should be easily fixed. In fact, I fixed it in another version of this in another branch. Yeah, it shouldn't do it because I told it to remember and check if they're valid before creating them, although most likely I did something that just busted it.
All right, we're good.
All right,
we can hop
we're back
in.
up. So,
Yeah.
go back to where we were.
We know
show-
not to do that, and like you said, it's a thing that you can fix.
But it is kind of interesting to go to this and use a large curl noise and just watch the velocities, because you get kind of an interesting effect as you see the different colors kind of mix. Just useful for kind of debugging. And there's a lot of different ways to tweak this when it comes to different things for the start velocities, etc. And I can also use a radial force, which basically is a force that just pushes away from the middle, which is interesting because it doesn't really work very well by itself because a radial force is highly divergent. It says all the fluid is leaving this one point. And if not for our temperature, let me turn that off. If not for the temperature, all it kind of does is just kind of oscillate. So that's what happens if you just have a radial force by itself. It just kind of creates a pressure wave and then collapses in on itself.
And that's also in 3D space, like all of that, or is
Yes.
this, yeah. That'd be
So
really cool.
again, this is with a huge radial force in the middle of this little puff cloud. It just kind of creates this strange oscillation.
My immediate thought was when I saw that ping was like if I'm in a VR game and I touch something and I want to see like you have accepted the button, and like makes
Yep.
that like volumetric ping shape is really cool.
There is a way to watch the preview velocity or watch the pressure and the velocity. Let me see if I can show that at all right now. It should be under debug, show velocity, and then debug pressure amount. Okay, so we should actually see the pressure wave down there. Oh, there we go. So the pressure wave is basically that red and green ring that's moving around inside there. Let me turn that off. So yeah, if I have no pressure being shown, that's all that happens. But yeah, so that's just to show that a radial force is not all you really need to get an explosion. You also need to provide some variation in the edges for that field. So mixing some curl noise with some radial force can be a good way to do that. And you don't always have to go preview your velocity either. You can just, so notice with that radial force with the curl noise, it made it expand in a lot more interesting of a way.
Yeah, it was
There we
almost
go.
sharp.
So, and if again we want to see what the effect of the radial force was, if we turn it off, now we have just the curl noise, which you can see it initiates in a much more linear way, kind of from all of the positions. Whereas with the radial force, it kind of provides a little bit of that mixture of the pressure wave to make it a little bit more interesting. Someone's saying baking out the simulation to a 3D flipbook. Not a 3D flipbook, but a 2D flipbook, yes. And that's one of the things I'll be showing last with a separate version of this map here. Just going to try to go over some of the different controls first. So again, going back to the temperature color setup, you can of course change the noise strength. You can get a perfect ball or a really gnarly looking amount of stuff if you want to. And if you want to change the type of noise, you'd have to pop into this color seed material, which again is nothing too crazy. It's similar to that other one we saw before, where we have the volume coordinates. Here's the Voronoi noise, which is creating those billowy shapes. And then we're basically offsetting it by changing the scale with the blueprint. And then here is the sphere that forms the kind of interior part of that. And then just some other parameters for overall multiplier, which is what this guy here does, this overall density multiplier. You know, I can set it to, you don't want to have it too hard because then you'll create hard edges. For example, if I get really close to this and I set the density to be like 5,000, you'll actually start to see the Minecraft shaped voxels. which only happens if you use a really crazy high density. Even 50 is not that bad, or 100. And if you want to see the effect of some different resolutions, currently it's important to remember this 128 cubed doesn't work without a quick one-line change to one of the common.usf files, so it'll look broken because it's taking the frame layout as a scalar instead of a float 2. But pretty much most of the other ones work like 100 cubed. If we get close, we can start kind of see the change of the resolution. So notice it behaves differently at lower resolutions and runs much faster. 196.
I like the one that says beware on it.
Yeah, beware. So again, people are asking about performance. You shouldn't use 256 cubed unless you have probably a 1080 video card. And even the 1080 has trouble with 400 cubed. I'm going to go ahead and do it just for the heck of it.
For note,
it's
I
going to
think
be
we have
really
a Titan
slow.
X in this thing, so...
Yeah, 400 cubed is not a good idea. It's probably choking. Yeah, that's why it says beware. This runs a lot better on my machine upstairs. This may not be it.
What do you have in your machine?
I have a Titan Pascal. Is this not a Titan Pascal?
Oh no, this is like one of the older Titans apparently.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would not do 400 cube unless you have a Titan Pascal. 256 cube is about the highest you should go. Is for most cases. 196 is probably good for 980 level. And again, if it's ever running bad, try just increasing the pressure divisor to 2, and that just gives you quite a bit back. Yeah, it's funny, I have the Titan Pascal at work here, but at home I have a 980, so it does give me a little bit of a reality check once in a while to make sure I'm not just leaving things checked in with crazy, high iteration counts and things like that. And another thing I would recommend people do is to do r.separate translucency screen percentage 50, because you're not going to really need the resolution of the full screen for the ray march, and going down to 50% really helps. And you need to make sure that you have separate translucency enabled under project settings under rendering. And that's even on the Titans, I tend to do that because the ray marching is pretty expensive. Where is it? Translucency. So this box here, separate translucency, should be on by default, but it will enable that to work. And you don't want to go too low, like 25, because then it'll start to look, pretty pixelated. Which I don't know, you probably can't tell on YouTube, but you can go as low as 25 without getting horrible artifacts. But I usually do 50, and that's just kind of a good halfway point. So we've gone over most of the seeding of the velocity and the color field. So simulation, time step is, again, pretty much just how quickly we want this thing to evolve. If I did time step of half, it goes a little bit more slowly. And that's mostly if you wanted to control this to be controlled by sequencer or something like that, you could set that time step to be dilated for various reasons. The other thing that I haven't mentioned is constant curl, which I guess, oops, I just did that again, didn't I? I didn't mean to. I accidentally dragged this slider. Thankfully it didn't crash. Okay, so just trying to expand this field out. There we go. So constant curl strength. Going to go ahead and turn off my other seed noise real quick. Set that to 0, and just make sure nothing moves. Oop, I still have my radial force. Quickly turn off the radial force because we don't want that to interfere. So now when I simulate, nothing should happen. Good. So if I turn on constant curl, even around 0.1, it's basically adding some overall noise every frame to this. It just adds some interesting kind of breaking up.
It's like instant dementors, honestly.
Exactly,
like,
yeah.
Here's your Harry Potter effect right there.
And I'll basically use that if I'm doing something like a flame effect and want to just break it up more, because it might form too much of a stable equilibrium where it's not very interesting. So down here under fluid simulation, under maps, I've got a couple different versions here, such as this, the fire pit one, which the only thing I've done is I've moved down this seed point a little bit down underground, and I've told it, instead of just using seed, you'll notice that down under simulation here, there's this emission curve. That's actually just a curve asset from the content browser, and it can specify how long things emit during the life of the simulation. So I've specified a curve that doesn't end, and then I have these two settings here, emission multiplier and temperature multiplier, and those should be pretty obvious. but they basically mean how much temperature and smoke to add into the sim every frame. And since this curve is going on forever, it just won't stop. So for example, if I set temperature to 5, we should have a lot more temperature now. It gets a little bit hotter. Just to demonstrate what the curve does, I can go back to the curve and just drag this down. So let's say we want this to be a 2-second long effect. We'll set time to 2. So now we've got a linear ramp from 0 to 1 that takes 2 seconds. So we should be able to play this. And we should have a nice little 2-second fire. And there we go. So the only thing that's really different here is that it still emits seed from this guy. So I kind of made it big and placed it down under the ground so that just the top of the sphere was poking under, which was just kind of a quick way to emulate a fire pit. But you can see it's emitting from that. And constant curl is nice for this because without it, sometimes, even though you have curl in the beginning, it'll get a little bit too stable and look a little bit fake. I'm going to go ahead and turn that life back up on here, just because I don't really want that to, never want the fire to go out. So this is without constant curl. You'll see it's just not that interesting after it's emitting for a while. It kind of forms an equilibrium. So constant curl on that source is just a way to kind of make it always wisping a little bit. It's almost as if you're simulating a wind or something that's blowing onto the fire. And you can go too far with it pretty quickly. Like if I go to constant curl of 0.5, it's probably just going to, it's just very turbulent. Or I can reduce the tiling of this. Let's say 0.1. Now we'll have very big constant wisps, which are probably too big. But you can see that there's a lot of room for tweaking and things like that.
Yeah, it would be pretty good for a magic effect, but nothing realistic.
Yeah, or if I did constant tiling of 4, we're just getting this weird texture everywhere, which could also be cool to mix. You get this very explosion-y look. And you could also go in here. All of this is taking place inside of the advection material, all these things like emission and other things, which is not the way things are traditionally done if you're talking about classical fluid simulation steps. I've just started doing that because the advection step is a good way to easily inject something anywhere. So for example, up top here is where I'm doing the constant curl, which, notice here, this is the actual curl noise node in the editor. We're not using that here. What we're using is a pre-baked pseudo-volume texture that has curl noise in it, and that's a lot cheaper to sample, saved around 200 instructions. And that's pretty significant if you're going to be running this every frame at a large resolution. So there's still some extra code here from when it was manual real-time or calculated curl noise. And again, a shout out to our engineer Marco Lano, who added the vector noise options to the material editor. And there's just tons of awesome possibilities using vector noise, which hopefully in some future time I'll show you guys some cool examples. But basically, sampling the pseudo-volume texture here is done by using the function volume texture function, which again is part of the material functions that we have down in the content browser under volume textures. So under functions, we have a bunch of different options for encoding, sampling, a volume edge mask, which is used for dampening towards the edge and things like that. And there's also an underscore tiling version of each texture or each function, which allows you to have seamless tiling. I'm not using that here because it doesn't really matter for this particular application. And then there's some other things happening in here. Like you might notice that the smoke is able to freely leave the boundaries here. There's some work here for dampening the inflow at the boundaries, because otherwise you can get this wild runaway simulation where velocities at the edge just keep increasing and take over the sim. So a lot of things are done in here. Even here is the, this is where I'm adding in the constant emission. So when I was tweaking that curve there, all of that was tweaking this, which is basically just a sphere mask. I have some density tweaks to it, and then I control the emission and the temperature with separate scalars, and those just get multiplied back in. And then I use this lerp here, is velocity, and the reason I do that is because I reuse this advection material for the velocity and the color texture. One thing I did in another branch that I hadn't had time to merge back here was to actually use a static switch instead of this lerp for the is velocity. and that allowed optimizing out instructions from the color advection that weren't necessary for velocity and vice versa. I just haven't had time to do that in here yet, but it does save a decent amount of cost, maybe 10 to 20% of the advection stage. But the biggest cost of the fluid sim is the pressure iteration. But actually, I'm just going to show some of the materials for the fluid sim because they're actually pretty simple. So if I go down to 3D, pressure iteration, this is the whole shader for the pressure iteration. And that's because most of this work is happening inside of this function volume offset samples, where you give it the texture, you tell it the resolution and the number of frames that it's laid out into, and it gives you the negative and positive sample offset for each direction. So in this case, we add up the pressure value from all of the neighbors and compare them to the divergence and see if it matches. And pretty much every stage looks like that. For the calculate divergence, it's again using that function just, and again, my GDC talk goes into more detail about this, but divergence is how much flow leaves versus enters any one cell in the simulation. And so to check that, we see how much fluid is crossing the cell by seeing how much is leaving on the positive x and negative x and getting those difference, and then figuring out how much is traveling vertically across the y cell and getting that difference, and then getting the difference between the z cells. And that tells us how much divergence there is, which in a stable fluid, it would be completely, it would be in equilibrium, which means that there's no or very low divergence. So someone just asked on the chat, what is this? This is a content experimental plugin, which does its own volume remarching and allows you to create the volume textures inside of here. And if you wanted to combine the volume painting flow maps with this, you could do that by saving out your manually painted flow map and then going to the seed velocity setup and injecting that into the seed velocity material. In fact, there's actually a hook right here for it that I haven't completely used yet, which allows for you to seed with a texture. And then you could basically paint the flow maps to start your simulation. Can these BPs use the C++ conversion to speed up? In this case, it wouldn't really benefit from that because the vast majority of the time is going towards on the GPU, just iterating over these render targets. And again, the pressure iteration is the one that gets called the most. So down here under basic setup, this pressure divisor is 1, and our resolution is 196, which means it's actually 2744 in 2D. But the number of pressure iterations is defined here by Jacobi iterations. So again, if you don't use any iterations there, say if you did 0, you're just going to get a pretty crappy looking sim. It's not going to ever resolve fully. So it takes multiple steps of that. And that part doesn't really suffer from CPU blueprint speed. It's pretty much all on the GPU. And if you want to look at that, you can do this and then do profile GPU. Oh, look at that. We're finding all the crashes today. All right.
Solving problems on the fly.
Profile GPU should show you, at the very top, there will be a world tick category, and that will include the time for rendering everything that you've done with the draw material to render target interface. So it'll actually show you a separate pass for each draw event. I'm going to try that one more time real quick, because maybe there's a chance. Okay,
They're pointing out a chat. You didn't even submit the bug report. How are you going to know to fix it?
So in this case here, this one was taking 25 milliseconds, which is quite a lot. And we can, oh look, here's a bug. So this is giving us bogus names for these draw events. It should tell us it was a draw to render target. But if you expand these, it tells you what the iterations were. So we can see that each pressure iteration was costing 1 millisecond. And if we actually counted, there'd be 20 of these because our default iterations is 20. So basically, those 20 iterations were 20 milliseconds of our 25 milliseconds. If we go down to this blueprint onto basic setup, set pressure divisor to 2, and then simulate. So now our time is down to 9 milliseconds. And notice that each pressure iteration is now only a quarter millisecond. And that's because we dropped the resolution of the pressure. And a quick note, I'm not actually dropping the Z resolution because I'm just scaling the render target in 2D, but the number of frames remains the same, which means the Z axis still has full resolution. And to fix that, I didn't do because it also requires that code change to allow for non-square layouts of the pseudo volume So there's some potential speed up there at some point by fixing that. One final thing I wanted to show before getting to the flipbook stuff, so we're almost through everything, which is good. Under fluid simulation maps, I have got this other one, fire pit vortex. And I've also shown how you can do constant curl, but there's this other concept in the simulation of constant swirl, which is basically trying to make a tornado. So here under constant curl, there's this other parameter, constant swirl, which is not yet hooked up to the blueprint.
I like the name. It's good.
Well, curl was taken, so. If we play this without it, you'll see we just have this kind of emitting fire just kind of randomly going in all directions.
It's very violent.
If we add constant swirl, and this is created by basically getting a radial vector to the center of the volume and then swizzling it. So instead of xy, it's a negative yx. And that's pretty much all a vortex is a swizzled radial value. And then we add some of that in. And I'm also doing something where I try to push back into the center, because otherwise you get this problem where the vortex kind of wants to diffuse outwards and fluid will just leave the volume too much. So this is almost like saying it's blowing in towards the thing. So now we have constant swirl. We were able to get like
swirl.
A constant curl plus
your next
constant
one, man.
swirl. So we've got this crazy flame tornado.
Beautiful.
Yeah, constant twirl. Someone said it should have been. That would be better. Too late.
That's what it is now.
The reason I wanted to show this one was because it's a good chance to show the things like the dampening versus erosion. So they are actually different. Dampening multiplies the density each frame by that amount, or actually it multiplies it by 1 minus this amount. So dampening of 0 does nothing. Dampening of 1 pretty much kills it. Whereas erosion subtracts this amount. And they have different characteristics where dampening tends to have a smooth fall off and a soft fall off at the edges like that, whereas erosion tends to have harder edge details exposed. So if I'm going to turn off dampening, turn on erosion, and we might have to kind of feather in on what's the right amount. So it's not exactly the same sensitivity because they both favor different ranges. So you kind of want to just sneak up on the amount you need. So again, 0.2 was not enough. Let's go 0.5. There we go. So you can see that we still have a very dense fluid all the way up to our end there. So if I even do 0.75, there we go. Now we've got a very sharp tornado.
Yeah, it looks like that would be a really great effect for Paragon, like one of the characters like throws that at you.
So sometimes you want to mix these two, like get most of the effect with the erosion and then add some dampening. But it tends to, they add up quite a bit. So you won't need much dampening if you have erosion, for example, as you can see here. It takes lower values. But now we have a little bit of a softer dampening effect with the erosion occurring. We might want to decrease that erosion a little bit more. So there we go. Now we've got a nice mix where we've got some hard edges, but we still have some fall off. So someone says, can this be done in 4.13? Currently this plugin is 4.15. And I tried to keep it in 4.14, but I must have accidentally opened it with 4.15 one day because it stopped working in 4.14 all of a sudden.
Oops.
And then I thought, uh-oh. Someone asked how to change the cloud volume color. So that's all inside the material here, which is under debug. We have two things, ray march material and volume ray march material. The ray march material, I'm going to go ahead and close down the advection. And this is pretty much a shader directly from that article on my blog where I went into ray marching, where we have some different colors for, let me just play this for a second. We have some different controls, for example, the temperature. This is kind of what I'm saying is the max temperature that the ray marcher will render. We can disable temperature there. We can change the ambient color. Sorry, it's always weird getting used to these tiny resolutions on these monitors.
We even tried bumping the resolution up a
hang on.
bunch for you. There you go.
Sometimes if it doesn't tweak when you change the parameter, you might have to recompile the shader. So that's what the density does, or the ambient color, sorry. This is the sun color. And we can change things like, currently the number of shadow steps is pretty low at 12. The more shadow steps you do, the more detail you're going to get. But you can do things like, actually, you know what, I'm gonna go back to the other map because this is not the best one to show the ray march. Or I can just move this guy up, and then we will get to the flipbook thing real quick. We're running out of time here, but we should have a few more minutes.
Yeah, but you know what? This is just a good excuse to have you come back on. If you're not busy Thursday.
There you go.
You know.
So density is really high. I turned off the sky color. Now I'm just going to turn up the sun color, which you can see there. And we can change the density of the main light by changing the shadow density here. Oops. So shadow density is basically how much it blocks light. And yes, in correct volumetrics, you wouldn't have separate controls for density and shadow density, but I tend to favor artistic controls rather than saying you can't tweak this because it's not mathematically allowed, because I'm kind of the opinion that most volumetrics is not accurate enough to the point to hide behind using PBR as an excuse not to expose controls that artists want. And I do get into debates with certain people are based off that philosophy.
What inspired this plugin?
So this is something, we have this thing called Epic Friday here at Epic, where once a month people are encouraged to just work on any kind of cool project that's outside of their standard responsibilities, and then just show the company what comes out of it. This being able to paint a volume texture started out as just a real quick Epic Friday thing back in maybe September or August. And then when I was giving the GDC talk, I used that as a chance to kind of start working on this stuff and adding features and making it better. And since then, I've gotten to work on this more during my regular work hours in between other projects, and also just doing it kind of from home a little bit. Sometimes I'll just decide to mess with it and add some features. But yeah, it's always something I wanted to do, because when I started doing 3D texture stuff initially, I realized it was hard. You had to use a lot of different external programs, and the results were not always good because the iteration time was low. So I really wanted to have a way to just be able to author these and be able to do the tweaks in VR, which this was a great case. And we're actually using a lot of this stuff for an internal thing that's not announced yet that we'll show you guys soon, which it turned out to be a cool case for making stuff for a cinematic, where we could crank up the settings and not have to worry about the performance. So here's a little map where I have this other guy, the sub-UV maker. And you'll see he's pointed at this fluid sim. And when I do the sim, notice it captured this to a it captured this to a flipbook while we were doing that. So we can actually look at this here.
Yeah, how exactly did that just do it?
So when we play, there you go, flipbook.
That's incredible.
So the way that works is by, it's a blueprint that is based off of the class of scene capture actor. So we find it in here. It is made off of scene capture 2D, and it has some, it's pretty simple really. That's the whole blueprint aside from the construction script. Construction script just basically sets the time per frame to capture. And then on tick, it just makes sure that how much time has passed, and it only allows capturing on the right interval. And then it tells it to draw a frame. And this is a good example of draw to render target using the more expanded begin draw and end draw, which allows for not rendering to the entire render target. So here we're rendering to just each individual sub-UV position by taking the number of X and Y frames and basically subdividing the size here. And then we offset the size by using this macro 1D to 2D index, which is part of, I did this, oh, not coming up. So another little freebie inside of this shader bits pack is under blueprint libraries. There's some conversion macros. And these have some macros for 1D to 2D, 1D to 3D, 2D to 1D, and 3D to 1D, which are really useful when you're doing different things like this. So we basically keep track of the current sub-UV frame as an integer. And of course, at the end of each frame, we increment that. And that tells us the 1D index. And then this basically figures out where that frame needs to offset. So notice our screen size, instead of being the normal render target size, is divided by the number of frames. So we're basically just rendering a tiny frame and then offsetting at each frame. And hang on, I guess I really screwed up this ray march material, which is funny. Turn that back down, turn temperature back up. Or I think it was at 10,000. And another thing to note of the brightness of the temperature and the impact of it has not been physically calibrated in any way. It's pretty much set up for artistic control. But so now we should be able to play that, and we get an updated sim. And a lot of this, you'll kind of want to look through the eye and realize, oh, maybe we want to back this off a little bit and reduce the FOV. So we might want to, I turned off capture on movement, but that may have been a mistake. So when we, there we go. Because then that way you can move it around. It's still not capturing. There we go. So basically, you might have to play with it a little bit to match the exact position to where you're not seeing the edge. But yeah, so once you've done that, you've just got a static texture, and you can go ahead and find that sub-UV texture, go into the content browser, right-click on it, and say Create Static Texture. And now you've got a static texture of that. There's a couple of one quick note about sampling that thing. Inside the material here, because these textures include the alpha has already been multiplied into the opacity, not because I did it manually, but because it happens just during the ray march kind of implicitly. So you want to make sure that you use alpha composite blend mode. If you don't do that, you actually have to unpre-multiply in the sub-UV compositing stage, which is a little bit non-straightforward. So I just left this. I left the alpha composite on the sub-UV rendering side. Oh, so someone asked, what about the stuff on the ceiling of the volume? So that is just an artifact in this case because I've moved this this point underneath, and my volume doesn't completely mask the ceiling. It masks the temperature, but there's basically ways of fixing that by going into places like the advection stage, and it should already be doing that. I believe. So basically, it's filtering to the top frame again inside the ray marcher, and normally I would offset black on the edge a little bit more. So for example, if you go down to simulation advection material, there's this here. This is a volume mask which is applying to the colors, and it may just not. It may need to be a little bit larger. Oh, here's maybe the problem. I don't have the right frame count being used there, so that could have just been a problem with this material. And maybe so we can say there's way more black space. And you can't really do this on the velocity because if you cushion the velocity, that creates a wall which the fluid will actually bounce off of, which is why there's a lot of work here for this fluid inflow boundary. But most of the fluid boundary stuff takes place in the material function that is used for the offset samples. So here, material functions, volume offset samples. This is what does all the samples for the offsets. And I'm doing this in a little bit more optimized way because it knows it's a pseudo volume. So I only look up the X and Y offsets as a simple 2D offset. And then I just use some of this 1D to 2D conversion math for the Z frame offsetting. But you'll notice here that I clamp the UVs to never go beyond the edge, half of the edge texel on the edge of that frame. And that kind of keeps it from seeing into other frames and sees it from reflecting and kind of allows the fluid to exit beyond beyond the edges. So hang on, someone is saying in the chat that they fixed an issue by clamping the volume texture. Had to floor your seal function to avoid the effect. So I'd have to look into that a little bit because clamping the volume texture shouldn't really do anything because that already happens inside here where it clamps for each frame edge. And it also clamps inside here during the advection stage. It has to clamp a little bit differently for the X and the Y because the pseudo volume, the Z, is kind of stored differently. But again, it's clamping to the half texel offset for the X and Y coordinates. But yeah, so increasing this mask here is probably the best way to do it. So it looks like I've gotten through most of the things I wanted to show. Let me see if there's anything.
We have a ton of questions that I've got lined up too for you.
Just real quick, I'm not going to spend much time on it, but since this was also kind of a follow-up to my GDC talk, it also has some of the other examples. For example, this hip mask guy, which he's compiling shaders. What is he doing? Huh, this is weird. Why does he have no shaders? Missing texture input, hang on. Looks like I forgot a noise texture, hang on. I don't know what texture it could possibly be, but I'm just going to find something gray. I think I must have forgot to put in a noise texture, but anyways.
And we have quite a few people that were asking about collision and all that too, so that would answer that.
That worked it. Huh. I guess gray was not the right color to use for that. Let me try black.
Was a color.
Gray, black. Yeah, that was I was using an edge modulation texture to kind of break up the painting of this damage mask. Huh, well, that's too bad. Maybe it needs to be white. Hang on. Sorry about that, guys. I knew there would be a couple little things like that. So there's blank white texture in here. Or I guess I could have just put in a constant 1.
You know,
I think we got it.
you just add more texture call, it's fine.
All right, come on. No? All right, well, that one is broken because I guess I'm missing a texture. But that shows the painting on a damage map, which I'll update that and check it in the fix, as well as the painting the 2D flow maps, which is not terribly interesting after the 3D stuff, but still it's kind of fun to get in here and you can paint your big, swirls or whatever.
Yeah,
It's
make
like
sure
the
that your rivers flow in a certain way.
sensitivity is a little bit low on it. So someone's
But
talking
all
about
these
you can...
all these are maps within the same provided project that we've been giving out, right?
Yep, everything
Correct.
is. So
Cool.
pretty much the way it's broken up is each little thing, fluid simulation has maps, hit mask render has maps, painting volume textures has maps for the VR stuff, SubView Maker has its own map. Not all of them do. Voxelize meshes. This is not hooked up and implemented fully here yet. This allows you to voxelize a skeletal mesh and get its motion vectors and use that. But I didn't have time to fully get that hooked up.
So you can have a smoke person running around,
Yep.
basically.
So hopefully soon, maybe in a couple days, I'll finish migrating that stuff over and re-release an update. Currently, there's a link on the forums to this project under, is it events? I think the thread is.
Oh yeah, under the forums.unrealengine.com events section for this particular stream here, you can pick up the download for it. Or if you go under the assets section of the forums, it should also be available under there. But if you look up this stream in particular, it'll show up. Also, if you're watching the YouTube archive, I'm going to make sure that that is in the description as well. But we've been posting it in chat constantly.
There was another thing here where right-clicking. Oh, there we go. Right-clicking is always adding green paint, but to the middle. That's not too fun.
A couple things to be aware of.
Yeah, a little bug. I tried to make it so that you could do both painting and dragging velocity, but yeah, it looks like that broke.
All right.
At least it's kind of working.
Cool. Want to do some questions?
Any other questions?
Oh, we got tons. I've got a
Yeah,
list
let's
of
do
them up
that.
over here.
Kind of lost track of the chat.
It's all right. Let's see. Can the volume be a custom shape, or does it have to be a square?
So currently, it is set up to be a square. It can be non-uniform as long as you modify the blueprint to pass in the non-uniform scale. The only part that doesn't work very well with it is the sorting with opaque geometry. It will get a little bit messed up when it's non-uniform. But I actually do have, that reminds me, the one thing that I have in here that is not fully set up is under volume textures. There's this CT scan, which is, I've converted a CT scan of a turkey head into a volume texture, and you can put it on one of these Raymart shaders. And it's actually meant to be non-uniform, and it holds up as long as you scale the mesh non-uniformly. But there are some sorting issues. But yeah, so you can see here, it's like each slice of the CT scan is a frame in the flipbook. And again, that was meant to be included here with the blueprint to make that, but it's not, didn't make it over.
That's a CT scan of a turkey?
It is. In fact, there's a YouTube video on it. If you guys search under my account, I posted it on Thanksgiving. It was my fun Thanksgiving experiment was a 3D turkey head.
All right, cool. That sounds like a fun experiment, I guess.
Some more bonus content. Was there any other questions we want to go to?
So, let's see. So everything has to be inside of the volume in order to render. One person was asking if I have a jetpack and I want it to create a plume out of the bottom of it. How should I go about attaching that, or bring it along with me?
So yeah, normally what you would do there is you would move the sim and keep it local to the backpack. And instead of using the backpack velocity, the backpack would always have a velocity of 0, and you would always be writing the background velocity. So it's like the air around the backpack is moving rather than the backpack, if that makes sense. But it turns out that they're the same thing in terms of fluid dynamics. It doesn't matter which one is moving. That just gets back to relativity, where there's no absolute velocity. Everything is relative to something else. So if you move your sim, you just need to be saying that the air is moving backwards in that frame of reference, if that makes sense, instead of moving the backpack. But again, there will be challenges getting this to work with a long pluming smoke trail. It wasn't really intended yet to work that way. And in fact, the way that programs like Maya handle that kind of problem is they actually have adaptive simulation that will grow the simulation domain over time. And while that's certainly possible to set up in this system, it's a little bit tricky and also not that conducive to real-time, just straight up on the GPU rendering. That's not to say it couldn't happen or it won't happen, but currently it's just not going to be that easy to make this work for trails. You'll want to end up using a very smaller force so that you get more bounds, or scaling the volume on Z or something like that. Hopefully at some point I'll do a follow-up and show how you can get different non-uniform scales working.
Oh, that'd be
but
really cool.
it's not too difficult to set up.
Oh, right.
In most cases you can just scale the mesh.
And since these are, I mean, are these, since they're technically meshes, do they cast shadow, or is this something you'd have to fake in?
So currently there's no shadowing or any support like that with this stuff. It all computes its own self-shadow. But you could do something like a fake shadow mesh that uses a single slice, or even does a few sparse traces through the volume to come up with a shadow, and put that on either a light function or a translucent card that uses world position behind translucency, or something to that effect. So there's ways of approximating it right now.
Could we see one of these with a shader complexity turned on, just to see what it looks like?
Sure. It's not going to be the most accurate, mostly because
There it is.
so it's not going to be very accurate.
Because it's the volume itself, right? Oh boy.
Well, the reason why is because in this ray march material, it's because it uses a loop here that is for I to max steps. And because this max steps is a scalar, and we haven't told it to unroll, it's actually only showing us the cost of one iteration of the loop. So that actually, the shader complexity doesn't know about how many iterations you're telling it to do. Sometimes you can kind of unroll a loop manually. For example, if it won't work if you have a scalar for the loop count, but if we said max steps was 10, and then that still didn't do anything other than it dropped the instruction a little bit. But if we put in here this unroll macro, we can see if it actually does it. It may or may not until unroll. So it's taking longer to compile. Yeah. So when we unrolled the loop, now we got an accurate count, and the instruction count went up to 1957. So it's fairly beefy, and then we'll actually get a, there we go. So that's more the true cost, untroll.
Cool.
And that's just a neat tip for you guys who are writing loops and things like that and not aware of that. You can never really get an accurate instruction count unless you unroll the loop with this macro, and you also are not using a variable or a scalar parameter for the loop count. Because I'm pretty sure if I go back to the actual steps here, I think it'll take forever and it will say it failed to unroll. Yeah, okay, so see this here? Unable to unroll loop, does not appear to terminate in a timely manner. That's because it doesn't really know how to unroll something when it's a scalar as the count without more guidance in the compiler, which isn't really something you'd want to do anyways, because it doesn't make sense to unroll something if you don't know how many to unroll.
Awesome. Let's see. Can you make these interact with objects? I guess, do they have any kind of collision or the ability to kind of fake collision?
So there is the ability. It's not hooked up for 3D right now, but basically in this 2D version here, when I'm moving this around, this is acting as a boundary, and it's actually building up a pressure wave. So notice when I move this around, it actually pushes fluid in front of it. And so that's basically just using, I have a texture, which if I pause this and click my sim, I can go down to render targets and look at stuff. For example, what was I going to show? The obstacle texture. So this is the texture for that thing I'm dragging around, which shows where that, for one, I have the edge boundaries in black as well as the ball in black. And then red and green, if I continue to play the simulation while looking at this, you can see I actually write the velocity to the whole texture. But it only reads it where that blue channel is black, so probably better to show it like that. So it's using that to actually build up pressure waves. And if we look at the pressure texture as well, oops. So I always hate that you can't click on stuff when you're paused. You have to go through the scene outliner. So if we watch the pressure texture and then we move around, you'll see that there's a lot of pressure. When I move quickly, there's a lot of pressure being built up in front of this thing. And that's what causes the fluid to get displaced. So pretty much all you need to do is have a 3D texture of your boundary and then do the same exact boundary condition, and then it will work. I had actually wanted to get the 3D boundaries working for this, because then you could do something cool like wave your hand in VR and displace smoke and move through it. And I don't think it'd be much more than a couple hours worth of work to get it all working. Just kind of had to punt it for now. But yeah, at some point we'll get that working, or I'm happy to help answer questions if people want to try stuff like that on their own, because it shouldn't be too crazy.
Cool. How long did you spend making this? Like all of this entire
I don't know. Like
thing?
altogether, it's been a few. It's been many months off and on. I don't work on this every day, or even every other day. But at least once or twice a week, I work on it for a few hours of work, and then I bring it home and do some tweaks and polish and things like that. And then getting the chance to use this stuff for one of our internal cinematics gave me a chance to work on it a lot more recently. So it's gotten a lot more polished. Although the last couple days for me, I kind of had to spend that pulling back changes from that other branch and merging them over here, because obviously we wanted this to be on a public branch, which this is for 4.15 for those who missed that part.
Yeah, and this is forums.unrealengine.com. I actually just fixed the link again because the Dropbox one got over flooded, but luckily the IT guys managed to give me a properly hosted one, so
Awesome.
that's awesome. Let's see, Noobs Disrubes is asking, does it support RGB blending in the Raymarch loop? You might have answered that. It's somewhere in there. I don't know.
It depends on which shader you're talking about. Currently, I just have a single channel for the painting volume texture and fluid sim stuff because of the way that I kind of channel pack for the fluid sim. I always write just the raw painted value into the red channel. The green channel is where I write the value of the preview brush, which is that little green emissive ball that shows where the density is going to go. And then the blue channel is where it stores the flow map distorted version of the red channel. So there's really no room to do that. But there's a whole other thing here which we didn't really go into, which is down here under Raymarching blueprints. There's this sample IBL blueprint, which this allows you to actually specify a cube map and Raymarch static lighting into the cloud, which I was hoping to show that in more detail, but I guess we're kind of way over already. But at some point I'll show some of that stuff. Yeah, so it's this blueprint sample IBL. And this is actually set up to work with the other blueprint as well. So if you go to the VR volume paint level, if you click on this and you change this material from Raymarch lit linear steps preview no curl to, which one of these is static lighting? So baked lighting. It's probably going to look weird because it's probably using the wrong texture. Yeah, it's using a curl noise texture as my baked lighting right now. But if you specify here under basic setup an IBL blueprint, so if I go ahead and drop down that Raymarch blueprint IBL, and if I now tell this guy about him, now it's actually doing image-based lighting on that, which I think it's set to be really dark right now. Yeah, I guess I left this in with bad defaults. So the sky color is set to be 0, and I still have a sun color as well. But if we want to look at just the sky, hang on, gotta compile. There we go. So this allows you to light your volume with a cube map, which right now, I stripped every cube map out of this project except for one that I made because there was potential legal concerns with using some of the ones we bought, which this is just from our GDC demo. It's a little very unlit under the water cube map, which is why it's not looking too interesting. But you can try different cube maps here and you get a really nice looking IBL look. And so this volume is now set to tick this IBL volume. As long you don't want this box on the IBL to be ticked as well, because then it'll be double ticking. So there's a couple rough edges with this. And it's actually a little bit slower right now doing it this way because it has to rewrite this volume texture with the lighting and sample the cube map a bunch of times. But yeah, if you want to tweak those materials, this outscatter material here is basically what looks up the cube map, and it has a certain number of rays, which I'm just using this static array, so I have 8 random vectors that it marches for. And you can try out different vector patterns. I have this blueprint here, Random Vector Maker. So if we wanted to say we have 16 points, and we can show the vectors too, we can say how many candidates. With the number of candidates, it will get more accurate. And then it actually writes this array, which you can copy into a shader. I'm trying to get Notepad here. So, where is, there we go. So the blueprint actually writes out shader code that you can just copy and paste into that if you want more or less steps or change the sampling pattern.
That's awesome.
Sometimes with different sampling patterns, you get different things. And you can also change the MIP level at which it samples that cube map. Down here, there's this setting somewhere, MIP level. which you pretty much want to use a blurrier MIP so that you don't pick up noise and pick up like the one hot reflection of the sun on a car in your cube map, which would then be a really bright light in the volume. But when you're using this version of the shader, because it rewrites the volume again with the baked lighting, you can have color control, basically. That's where I was going with all that. So yeah, long way of saying yes, sort of, but not with the dynamic lighting version.
Well, I mean, that's a really detailed explanation, which is always awesome. All right, we are getting a little bit tight on time, so I'm going to try to grab one more of these questions here. Sporks was asking, are these determinate or indeterminate reactions?
That's a good question. Currently, they should be pretty deterministic, as long as you're not changing the time step. So in the past, I've seen things where the results are not always the same because the time step is not the same. Like I'm purposefully not making this what you would normally call frame rate independent, where you would use time step divided by delta time, which means if your frame rate gets low, more time passes in your simulation. I didn't do that here because when you take too large of a time step, you just get noise. So I figured since this was more for a content authoring pipeline, it was better to get good results first and then tweak the time manually second after it's captured to a flipbook. But there may be reasons why it's not 100% deterministic. It seems to be based on my testing.
All right. Cool. So that's the time that we have for today, but it seems that, well, one, we had a couple things happen, and you said you're going to make some updates too, and also there were a couple things we couldn't quite cover, and a couple things that didn't quite get implemented in this version of it, so we'll probably have to come back on and actually, cover everything else new that comes out and a couple updates that you are making. For those of you at home, the forum link is updated, and we'll have this in the YouTube description after the fact when it's all archived up and all that stuff. But that's the time that we have for today. Ryan, thank you. That was awesome. It's really good to have an explanation for all of this, because I'm sure if we just gave out the plugin as it is, it'd be a lot to take in at once. So for you at home, please check it out, try it out, come to the forums and tell Ryan what you think about it and give us your feedback. We like to hear what you have to say, and yeah, that's the time that we have for today. We'll see you all again on Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And yeah, don't forget, like, subscribe, follow all the little buttons and all the social media type things that we do here. Make sure that you have those so that you can know when we're about to do another live stream and you can get the latest information on Unreal Engine. So that's it for today. Yeah. So
All right,
we'll see
thanks,
you
guys.
around.
Take it
Bye-bye.
easy.